If you do what is right, you can never lose. William Wildblood. Naive, sentimental, careless, self-hating, jaded, nihilistic, decadent, downright stupid, all these and more are words that can be used to describe the current state of the West, which has signed its death warrant with its embrace of mass immigration. Certain sections of the populace are realizing this and refusing to be cowed by the usual epithets of racism and fascism that are thrown around to shut down serious debate and reflection. There are even calls for deportations in England and the USA. But what if there really were deportations on a mass scale, which may seem unlikely at present but is theoretically possible? Where would the West be then? Would it have solved its problems? It might redress the overwhelming of the indigenous population by alien people with very different priorities and loyalties, something that is apparent as their numbers increase, so removing any need to assimilate. However, without a serious spiritual revival, the countries of the West would simply be back to where they were 30 or 40 years ago, with all the spiritual sicknesses they had then. They might have saved themselves as ethnicities, and even from potential civil wars, but they would be still suffering from all the problems that brought them to where they currently are. The faults, both spiritual and intellectual, that caused their current plight would still be in place, and their state would be little better. Things have come to such a pass that no secular approach can put off the day of reckoning for the West. Intelligent political action would bring some benefits but cannot address a more deep-seated malaise. At the same time, it is certainly better to try to do something, even if you think that will only scratch the surface of the problem. Defeatism is weakness by another name. Nevertheless, the truth is civilizations run their course, and ours has. We still have choices though. We can go with the decay, be part of it, or we can see it and resist it, even if we know this resistance may be too late because the rot is too deep. Even if that is the case, there is still much to play for in spiritual terms. Outer circumstances will be what they are, but fighting against them, even if that is only within your own soul, will bring results. In fact, for most people the focus should be inwards. The benefit of living at a time of spiritual collapse such as now is that by standing apart from it you fortify your soul. You develop your spiritual muscles by having to swim against the tide. In a golden age you are spiritual by default. In a dark age you must earn your spirituality, but that means it is yours and cannot be lost. However, watch that word spiritual. One of the problems of living in an age of materialism and atheism is that when people do turn to the spiritual, they often turn to all kinds of false spiritualities, and now there are many. As always, it is your motivation that matters. A pure heart and a love of truth will guide you to the right place. If you seek the spiritual for personal benefit, you will not be so guided and may end up down one of the many blind alleys that seem to promise enlightenment, wisdom and power, but only offer shallow imitations of these things. Is it worth fighting when you know you are going to lose? Absolutely it is, because although you may not gain the outer victory, if you fight for truth you cannot lose. The victory will be in your own soul. Furthermore, resisting darkness creates a light of its own, which light will shine out for others, inspiring them to fight and gain their own inner victories. The outer always passes, but the inner remains. If you fight for truth, ultimate victory is assured. The moral of this story is that ongoing decline is inevitable because of the nature of these times, but that does not mean we should do nothing to try to arrest decline. It may be that we plant the seeds for eventual rebirth. Mercy versus Justice, and Mary the Mother of Jesus. Bruce Charlton. I am still reading Jeffrey Ash's The Virgin, his dense, fascinating, and very stimulating book about the historical development and meaning of the Catholic veneration of Mary, Mother of Jesus. Ash was himself a Roman Catholic, and deeply involved with Marian societies, especially the Carmelite friars' shrine to Mary at Aylesford in Kent. This passage was one I found very striking. Ash is describing the theology of Saint Germanus, who was Patriarch of Constantinople in the early 700s.
Mary, Germanus maintains, does not simply put requests to the deity on matters they could agree about, she actively and successfully opposes him. You turn away the just threat and the sentence of damnation, because you love the Christians. Therefore the Christian people trustfully turn to you, refuge of sinners. The universe is split at the summit. God stands for justice, and since we are all sinners more or less, most of us have little to hope for at his hands. Mary stands for mercy, and it is only because of her influence at court, not because of love or goodwill on God's part, that heaven is within reach for more than a handful of human beings. The Byzantine Virgin seems the only friend close to the throne and the only rescuer from utter awestruck despair. The Greek Church agreed that Mary was indispensable to salvation. An edict issued from Constantinople in 724 condemns anyone who withholds worship from her. She is no longer the gentle lady to whom Christians may turn for help. She is the unique being to whom they must turn or be in peril of losing their souls forever. From before 1233, the norm of Marian miracles and hardening. The people concerned are apt to be commonplace and sometimes repellent. The sole redeeming feature they have in common, redeeming quite literally, is their love for the Virgin. This protects them against the consequences of wrongdoing. Her devotees seem able to get away with anything. It is unfair to treat this mythology as a license to sin. By saving misguided mortals, the Virgin enables them to repent. But the moral is not always conspicuous. The medieval popular Virgin represented the all-too-human, the irregular, the exceptional. She was superior to the system and could break through every rule. Humanity had her on its side in its perpetual protest against the divine law and human ordinance. For her, every case was a special case. She could draw her sinner up out of hell itself, giving him another chance.
Such considerations stimulated various thoughts. One is that, however theologically alien and contradictory the role of Mary in Catholic devotion, the effect of Marian devotion has often been exemplary from what I regard as a strictly Christian perspective, as well as this worldly expedient, in terms of sustaining and strengthening the churches. I understand the above descriptions to represent a spiritual correction to the not Christian, i.e. not Jesus-derived, emphasis on justice that has so often overtaken Christian churches of almost every kind. When Jesus is made into a divine ruler of the universe, he has often been attributed with the characteristics of an idealized human ruler in some particular society, hence the de facto primacy of justice, defined legalistically, despite this being multiply contradicted in the Gospels. Furthermore, the tortured theology of original sin, which was only required because early theologians made it mandatory to conceptualize and define God as omni, led to the weird double negative explanation of Jesus' work, as having been accomplished by a vicarious sacrifice, torture and death, demanded by divine justice to compensate for sin. Against this historical backdrop of systemic misrepresentation of the fundamental nature of Jesus Christ's work and the paths to salvation by love of Jesus, Mary seems to have emerged, with the consequence of recreating the truth of Jesus' salvation by personal love. With the difference that the necessary love is displaced from Jesus, to his mother, but his mother having been reconceptualized to possess the salvific attributes of Jesus. But I don't doubt that this displaced or indirect love was none the less effective in attaining salvation for Marian adherents, so long as the motives were true. The simple heart of Christianity, i.e. resurrected eternal heavenly life to those who follow Jesus, has always been open to the kind of license to sin misrepresentation Ash describes in the second excerpt above. This is a kind of parody of Christianity, along the lines of, I can do what I like, be as selfish and gratification-seeking as I like. Yet Mary will save me if I love her. Such is exactly the same type of criticism made of Jesus' teaching during his life, by those whose real concern was social order and sustaining the power of their church. Popular with those who do not really believe that all men are sinners including themselves, and that no man good enough for heaven without first passing through death and resurrection. Or who may regard following Jesus as less a matter of love than of following rules. The parody is untrue, because it ignores that motivation is primary, and that the love really must come first. Salvation is not attained by using love as an excuse to enable the primary motivation of doing evil. That is to put this worldly gratification first. But, on the other hand, salvation really is, not for those who successfully passed some test of following some laws, but salvation is for all those who love and desire to follow Jesus more than anything else. Or, in this instance, love and desire to follow Mary more than anything else, so long as Mary is conceptualized in the way she has been by some ancient, and some modern, Catholic Christians, as described in Ash's book. I suppose I should state that I regard it as theologically incoherent from a Christian perspective to claim that Mary was conceived and existed without sin, and was assumed into heaven without going through death and resurrection. The necessity and work of Jesus, and the requirement that we are all incarnated into mortal life, only makes sense when it is understood that death and resurrection was and is the only way to fit us for heaven. Nonetheless, fortunately for all of us, theological coherence is not a requisite for salvation. Jesus made things worse, as well as better. Bruce Charlton. It has been noticed, even including by me, that a hell of torment seems to have arisen after Jesus offered the possibility of heaven. Apparently, before Jesus, the Jews, mostly, had a common destination of Sheol, a ghostly underworld to which all souls went after mortal death. But this wasn't a place of hellish torment, rather a place of semi-conscious insensibility, forgetting of identity. It seems to me that the choice to reject the gift of resurrected eternal life, in which personal identity is retained and love is the basis, therefore had spiritual consequences that did not exist before, or perhaps only seldom. The consequence of rejecting heaven is not necessarily hell, there are other possibilities, and the choice to reject resurrected eternal life need not be annihilation after mortal death, there are other possibilities. For example, reincarnation of some kind, nirvana, some kind of paradise, ghosthood, and obedient servitude to Satan that does not, at first, involve inhabiting hell. Nonetheless, the usual reasons, typical motivations, behind rejection of the offer salvation, may be what leads to worse outcomes than if salvation had never been offered and never been available. The choice to reject heaven has spiritual consequences that would not otherwise have arisen. Another potential way that Jesus made things worse is for those, many, who use Christianity, i.e. they use the religions that purport to define and administer the following of Jesus by individual people, to pursue selfish and worldly goals. Under this category can be put all the many appalling characters who have been bishops and other church leaders, and who used the excuse of Christianity mainly to pursue wealth, power, cruelty and resentment, and the masses and mobs who have done the same kind of thing, either by their own choice, or by enthusiastic obedience. I don't suppose Christians are materially worse than other religions in this respect, and not as bad as some atheist totalitarian regimes of the past century, although they were surely very bad, and from early in church history. But spiritually, it may be that there is something especially harmful about subordinating and deploying a kind of public Christianity from motivations of personal gratification and this worldly ends. This, in the sense that the dishonest abuse and distortion of what is essentially good has a particularly nasty quality, as when truly spiteful or sadistic people affect the attitude and emotions of kindness and compassion. Probably, this is far more deeply damaging to the soul than would be an acknowledgement of one's own evil tendencies. In these ways, it may be that the advent of Jesus Christ, and the choice he gave us to attain a resurrected eternal heavenly life of love, served to divide more sharply the saved and those who rejected salvation, the sheep from goats. Even though there are possibilities other than sheep or goat, the rejection of sheep affiliation may well be associated with an increased embrace of the goat option. When people behave much better than their beliefs, the reverse hypocrisy of atheist-materialism. Bruce Charlton. Mainstream, normal, modern Western people are atheist-materialists, who believe, assume, that there is neither purpose nor meaning in the universe, and that death means annihilation. This strongly implies that nothing really matters. Yet they behave much better than would be implied by their assumptions would entail. Indeed, some of the best behaved and most virtuous people are atheists/materialists/nihilists. In other words, they are reverse hypocrites. That is, they fail to live down to their beliefs. While this is, of course, overall a good thing, it is in tendency a bad thing. Because over time this reverse hypocritical atheist materialism has no principled grounds on which to oppose the continual erosion of morals and values. And therefore morals and values have not just become corrupted, but in many instances inverted, such that evil is advocated as good, and good demonized as evil. Furthermore, reverse hypocrites see no need to revise their beliefs, because at any moment in time they can plausibly deny the implications of their own assumptions. They can argue to themselves that, for instance, although they have no reason to refrain from lying and exploiting 24/7, they often tell the truth and genuinely try to help people. They always behave much better than they need according to their beliefs, from which they infer that it doesn't matter that their own asserted values permit, or even encourage, short-term selfishness, and justify living for personal gratification here and now. Probably is this reverse hypocrisy of the godless majority that has helped make ordinary hypocrisy into something regarded as an extreme form of wickedness. Such that mainstream modern media stories have a common narrative trope that excoriates respectable religious people for failing to live up to their public-spirited high ideals, while heaping praise upon selfishly hedonistic people when they, very occasionally, behave altruistically. Thus, an habitually altruistic and hard-working individual who preaches idealistic honesty but lapses from it into a selfish lie is a common villain of hypocrisy, while an habitual contrickster or thief can become the reverse hypocritical anti-hero by a single courageous act of truth-telling at the climax of the tale. In other words, reverse hypocrisy has become a cardinal virtue, while the hypocrisy of having higher ideals than can be reached in practice is treated as a cardinal sin. What is needed is for the reverse hypocrites to do a bit of hard thinking about why they behave so much better than their beliefs, and whether this is a good thing, or not. Because if we really do regard our good behavior as really a good thing, then surely we ought not to embrace fundamental beliefs and assumptions that actively contradict our good behavior. Expedience as justifiable corruption. Francis Berger. Expedience used to have two meanings, one positive, and the other negative. Of the two, the technically positive meaning of being useful, appropriate, or suitable for a specific purpose was usually overshadowed by the negative connotation of being useful for some purpose or self-interest at the expense of principles, ethics, and morals. People seem to have retained some awareness of the negative connotations of expedience, at least in theory. However, in practice, expedience has morphed into what can only be described as a justifiable positive. Another way of thinking about a justifiable positive is as a defensible negative, with the underlying understanding that the negative is at least partly perceived but quickly set aside and overridden by the self-serving albeit unprincipled positive that expedience helped generate. Within such a framework, the self-serving usefulness or advantages that expedience produces will always justifiably and defensibly trump all unprincipled, unethical, immoral, self-serving factors, regardless of how severe these may in fact be. Expedience as a justifiable positive has become ubiquitous and is easily detectable. The most obvious example is the "I would have done the same thing, and so would you" attitude often expressed when people learn of a politician or businessperson who benefited immensely from some fraudulent dealing or other. The exasperated "can you blame them?" or "he would have been stupid not to" outbursts, frequently expressed when people discuss individuals who chose self-serving advantage at the cost of principles, are other common instances of a justifiable positive. The lauding and celebration of crafty, underhanded individuals unleashing dishonest schemes at the expense of everyone but themselves is yet another example. As are the anti-heroes of popular culture who engage in the most despicable of activities for good causes, like manufacturing and dealing drugs so that he can secure his family's financial future before succumbing to a terminal illness. No, I have not seen the series, and I do not intend to. Or the ticket takers and careerists who understandably sell out their integrity for the promise of financial gain or increased influence. It even extends to those who vigorously defend the blatantly unprincipled actions of organizations on purely ideological grounds, or those who simply go with the flow despite recognizing the wrong direction the flow has taken. As is the case with so much these days, inversion lies at the core of expedience as a justifiable positive. In this case, the turning involved is as bold as it is blunt and brutal. It dictates that any corruption that benefits the self at the expense of principles, ethics, and morals is justifiable to the point of ceasing to be corruption at all. Expedience benefited someone, so it cannot be all bad. In this sense, expedience ceases to be a sin, and that which is not acknowledged as sin needs to be repented of. Unsurprisingly, expedience is officially endorsed and encouraged in this time and place. Self-serving is all the rage, yet it is a double-edged sword. The self does not end up serving itself but something else entirely. It becomes a servant to something destructive outside itself. Put another way, all self-serving really does is serve up the self, or a self, to sin, under the delusion that such service is sinless or, at the very least, justifiably sinful, even worse. Expedience as a justifiable positive aims to erode the true self for the simple reason that the true self, our spiritual self, can derive no positives from the kinds of unprincipled, unethical, and immoral self-serving purposes that expedience provides. The best it derives from expedience is negative experience that may engender positive learning. However, such learning can only occur if the sin of expedience is consciously acknowledged and repented. Without that, the true self remains unserved, abandoned for the sake of justifiable corruption. The late poet Tony Harrison, and the beliefs of characteristic 1980s liberalism. Bruce Charlton. The poet Tony Harrison, who lived near me in Newcastle upon Tyne, has recently died, and then we also met some of his relations by marriage. So he has been somewhat in mind lately, since there was a time in the late 1980s when I was on the left and also had a high regard for his writing. For a few years I probably regarded him as the best of living British poets. Although, to provide context, I did not, and do not, rate any living poets very highly, so it was more a case of being the best of a relatively mediocre bunch. Consequently, I stumbled across this rather interesting discussion of Harrison as a representative of a type of leftist writer with working-class origins who, via education, became middle-class and establishment-approved, and who spent the rest of their lives brooding, without ever reaching a coherent conclusion, on their own subsequent class alienation. There are many such writers, indeed just about all writers with such a social trajectory. Another who I have discussed here is Alan Garner. This problem, if it is one, seems to be restricted to writers and certain other analogous types, because the many more people who are not writers, such as my parents, many of my relatives and their circle of friends, who also experienced this class change, do not seem to have been much troubled by it. We lived a middle-class professional family life for most of the year, and then spent visits and holidays staying with our working-class grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins, without any of the angst or social friction so obsessively described in the post-war literature of Britain. But my focus here is on the description of Harrison as a typical leftist intellectual of the 1980s, a grouping to which I also belonged at that time, broadly, with a few reservations, as is usually the case. The author lists a set of beliefs that such people as Harrison, and myself espoused. Strongly anti-monarchy. Strongly anti-censorship. Strongly anti-religion. Anti-capitalist. Anti-racist. Anti-British Empire. Anti-America passively. Pro-feminist passively. Pro-gay passively. Pro-multiculturalism. Pro-democracy. Pro-welfare. Pro-miners, trade unions. Pro-learning, education, civilization, civility. Pro-European Union. It can readily be seen that the 1980s was therefore a time of inflection, between the British-originated, old left, focused on economics and class, and the US-originated, new left, political correctness or woke, that we have today, focused on anti-racism, feminism and sexuality. And environment, not mentioned in this list, but actually already very significant, albeit not near exclusively focused on CO2/climate manipulated delusion, which only became important from the 1990s. The old to new shift also went from, supposedly, aiming at equality of opportunity, to, supposedly, aiming to enforce equality of outcome, and then to inverting outcomes to favor individuals who claim to be members of groups that were, supposedly, historically underrepresented. The fact that the 1980s leftists' beliefs were mutually incoherent and incompatible seems more obvious now than it did then, yet hostile incoherence somehow never did, or does, seem obvious to those of the left. Extremely few people who were socialists in 1980 subsequently abandoned the left over the next decades, despite that leftism all but inverted from idealizing native male working class men, for example in the 1984 national miners' strike, to demonizing and attempting socially to annihilate, by multiple means, exactly the same group of people, accelerating from about a decade later, especially the Blair New Labour government of 1997 onward. This accommodationism of leftists ought to be a matter of shame, because it was motivated by little more than unprincipled expedience and sheer mental laziness. A typical post-millennial leftist is nowadays much more likely to idealize and aggrandize members of the hyper-wealthy Davos multi-billionaire class, than a coal miner or other manual worker. The history of Tony Harrison shows some detail of how this inversion happened, how these writers of working-class origin were co-opted into the globalist totalitarian strategy, a process marked by Harrison's lavish 1969 UNESCO traveling scholarship, 6 months fully paid international travel for the whole family, for a poet who hadn't even published a book. In other words, Harrison had already been identified as a promising subversive new leftist asset, in his 20s, whether he realized it or not, or else, very probably, he would never have been awarded this luxury freebie in the first place. It is a sad reflection of the value bankruptcy of leftism that vanishingly few of the ex-working class writers who were used as totalitarian assets were in the slightest degree aware of their role, of their raison d'etre among those who published, praised, paid and awarded status to poets and other authors. Typically, such writers instead mistook their own chronic, obsessive, class-based resentments and spite, for anti-establishment radicalism and righteous anger. And were encouraged in this by social incentives. And the same situation nowadays applies to writers who are, instead of being socialist ex-working class men, are women, racial or ethnic minorities, or sexually non-biological. I suppose one of the main jobs of such writers, from the perspective of those who manage their careers and sustain their livelihoods, is to spread through books, plays, TV, movies etc. the typical and pervasive left intellectual milieu of negation, resentment, atheist materialism, and a moralistic focus on this worldly gratification. A skillful and cultured author like Tony Harrison performed this role very effectively, as do many of his less skilled and uncultured successors. Well, we at least can observe such people across time, analyze and learn from their experiences, including when they themselves did not learn. Who was St. John? William Wildblood. Christine Hartley, 1897 to 1985, was a pupil of Dion Fortune and an important figure in the revival of the Western mystery tradition. In later life, she even wrote a book with that title. There, nestled among stories of Merlin and Arthur and the Tuatha De Danann and the Druids, there is a short chapter called St. John the Celt. When I first read this many years ago, I felt that rush of recognition you experience when something you knew but don't know you knew breaks through into the realm of conscious thought. It made complete sense. Christine Hartley gives some reasons for this, on the face of it, unlikely assertion, and while they are plausible they certainly don't prove that the beloved apostle really was a Celt. But that is besides the point, for this is more in a plain reality than something that is factually true in the outer world, which is not to say it is not outwardly true as well. She says that the original Celts came from the mountains around Ararat and Persia and migrated westwards, but that there may have been some who remained behind at various stages of the journey. I don't think this is currently accepted by modern scholars, but the Celtic people were certainly travelers, and there is no reason why some may not have ended up in the Holy Land. More to the point, she says that the Celt is a mystic who thinks symbolically. He is a poet and a dreamer. His spirituality is shot through with magic and mystery, and his view of the created world is that it still shines with God's glory if you look at it right. All of this is in St. John. None of it is in the rest of the New Testament, nor is it part of the Jewish religious temperament which is based on law and the hard reality of this world. St. John's Gospel and the Book of Revelation stand apart from everything else in the Bible. Their spiritual approach is mystical in a way that makes other parts of the Bible seem prosaic and earthbound. They glisten with an inner light that is typically Celtic. The imagery of the apocalypse, its expansive visionary quality and prophetic fire, might have partial roots in the book of Daniel, but, as Christine Hartley says, here is the poetry and imagery of the Celt from the first word to the last. The whole of the great vision lies before us in a glowing tapestry of angels and jewels and riders upon horses, so superbly described, that it is almost possible to catch a glimpse of the reality that lies behind them. Nowhere in traditional Jewish writing is there a sense of the spiritual nature of God one finds in the opening words of St. John's Gospel. This is unprecedented and separates him from the other apostles who, for all their qualities, seem dull and heavy in comparison, unable to transcend the material nature of the world and see spirit in the pure form conveyed by St. John. And then, as Christine Hartley points out, John invariably writes the Jews, as though they were to him foreigners, implying that he is, at the very least, from another background. Then you have the traditional representation of St. John. Obviously, the images we have of him and Saint Peter and Jesus himself were not drawn from nature, but they might have come from oral tradition, and, if we accept that Christianity is a divinely inspired religion, we should have no difficulty in believing that these images could also have been inspirational in origin. Peter is always a burly, bearded, rather fierce man of passion and energy, practical and tough, and somewhat bullish. Saint John is almost the opposite. He is youthful, sensitive and often fair-haired. A dreamy, almost ethereal quality comes from his pictures, as in this one from the 19th century. This is a Celtic poet. If Christianity was destined to spread beyond the Jewish world, as we must assume it was, then it would make sense to have a non-Jew as one of Jesus's closest disciples, someone who would then write about him from the perspective of an outsider to the very insular Jewish world. This writing would appeal more to the imagination of the intended audience and help bring them on board with the new, what was intended to be, universal religion. Its internal content, and unstated but inherent cultural signatures would resonate with them and help make Christianity a European religion, not a Jewish one, which was its destiny. None of this can be proved as the world seeks proof, but I maintain that on the level of myth and intuition it shines out with the clarity of real truth. Saint John was the primary medium through whom the Christian message was transmitted to the Indo-European people, and he was one of them. The Christ he revealed was the warrior king of Revelation, the Lord and ruler of all creation, whose face shines with the glory of the sun, the incarnation of a solar God much more than the Old Testament Jehovah. Creative engagement is the positive purpose of this mortal life. Bruce Charlton. I have often written here that the purpose of this mortal life must account for the extended nature of life, the fact that our life may continue for many decades. This implies that it is not enough to regard mortal life as a matter of what happens at the end of it, i.e. for Christians a matter of attaining salvation, although it is partly that. Also that mortal life is not just a matter of having experience of incarnating, of getting a body, although it is partly that. If salvation was the only reason for being alive, then we would die as soon as we had accepted the gift of Jesus, and determined to follow him. Given that we all must die eventually, this implies to me that God always has reasons for sustaining us alive. If we are alive now, there is divine work for us to do now. In other words, that for as long as a person lives, he has something, at least one thing, he ought to do, something that he would benefit from doing. I have usually expressed this in terms of learning from our experiences. The idea here is that God shapes our lives such that we have experiences from which we can learn significant, perhaps vital, life lessons. These life lessons include making the choice of salvation, and that is my understanding of why so many Western people have been living such long, indeed over extended lifespans in recent decades. Such people are being kept alive for longer than in the past, despite increased decrepitude of body and or mind, because they have so far rejected salvation. Their living experiences are being shaped to give them individually tailored further opportunities inwardly to reject, i.e. repent, their false and self-harming ideologies, and to embrace a future of everlasting resurrected life in heaven. I continue to regard this analysis as correct, but it is not the whole story, because it makes the purpose of life almost entirely passive, a matter of God setting the curriculum, albeit a curriculum unique for each individual, and then each person trying to do as well as possible to learning what this curriculum dictates. But life is not supposed to be a wholly passive business of dealing with the experiences that life brings to us. As each of us are beings who existed as spirits for an eternity before we were incarnated into this life, we all bring our unique natures and possibilities into this mortal life. In other words, just as God has an agenda, a curriculum, for each of us in this mortal life, towards which we have a formally negative and reactive role. In a complementary fashion, we also each have a positive agenda that we bring into this life. Because every individual being has potential to add his own unique perspective and qualities to the growth of divine creation. It is important to recognize that we are all unique beings, and the fact is therefore that it is our nature that each can, in principle, add something to divine creation that, if we do not contribute it, cannot therefore will not be contributed by any other being. Put different, we are each, by our nature, unique creators, and because unique, our creative engagement with reality will necessarily make an irreplaceable difference that reality. In engaging our life and the world, our innate creative potential will enlarge divine creation in ways that otherwise will not happen. I don't mean to assert this positive creative engagement as a duty, because that would just be another external curriculum item. But we don't just react to, we also have potential to act upon. I mean to emphasize that this mortal life is not just a matter of us negatively learning from life experiences that are presented to us, but also a matter of our divine selves entering into and engaging positively with this mortal life. Us, ourselves, having thoughts, grappling with understanding, engaging in loving relationships, making and doing, freely committing to purposes etc. each in our innately distinct way, and from the depths of our ultimately divine natures. And thereby making a positive difference, a better reality, and not just to this mortal world and while we are alive, but a difference to divine creation and therefore eternally. Man's chief end is not to be saved but to mount up, creatively. Francis Berger. Quote, "But life is not supposed to be a wholly passive business of dealing with the experiences that life brings to us. As each of us are beings who existed as spirits for an eternity before we were incarnated into this life, we all bring our unique natures and possibilities into this mortal life. In other words, just as God has an agenda, a curriculum, for each of us in this mortal life, towards which we have a formally negative and reactive role. In a complementary fashion, we also each have a positive agenda that we bring into this life. Because every individual being has potential to add his own unique perspective and qualities to the growth of divine creation." End quote. The above comes from creative engagement is the positive purpose of this mortal life, which Dr. Charlton posted earlier today. The title above sums up my convictions on the matter. However, as I read the post, I found myself wondering why so many Christians fail to grasp or simply reject the positive purpose of creativity. It did not take me long to realize the inability or unwillingness to accept creativity as the positive purpose of mortal life lay deeply nestled in Christian assumptions. More precisely, in the rejection of the assumption that each of us are beings who existed as spirits for an eternity before we were incarnated into this life, we all bring our unique natures and possibilities into this mortal life. The sort of creativity and positive purpose Bruce describes, the same sort I have done my best to describe on these pages over the years, makes no sense within the framework of traditional/conventional/orthodox Christian assumptions, in the same ways authentic freedom makes no sense. Reject the assumption of co-eternal beings, and you reject authentic spiritual creativity and freedom. Nevertheless, some Christian thinkers did achieve breakthroughs in this department. For example, Budayef ranks among the very few Christian thinkers who recognized and promoted creative engagement as the positive purpose in mortal life.
Salvation from sin, from perdition, is not the final purpose of religious life. Salvation is always from something, and life should be for something. Many things unnecessary for salvation are needed for the very purpose for which salvation is necessary, for the creative upsurge of being. Man's chief end is not to be saved but to mount up, creatively.
It should be noted that Berger achieved these insights while remaining faithful to a handful of orthodox assumptions he simply could not release. I am certain that his profound insights would have been even more profound had he been able to recognize that the eternal element he sought was inherent in eternal spiritual beings and not groundless, uncreated freedom. Unfortunately, creative engagement as a positive purpose in mortal life is largely denied or downplayed in Christianity, and it will probably remain that way until Christians begin honestly and earnestly re-evaluating some of their fundamental assumptions about reality and God. Note: creativity and creative engagement should not be interpreted solely as artistic endeavors. Creative engagement is a spiritual act that adds something new and unexpected to creation. Such newness can take many forms and can extend to any aspect of mortal life. The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis, spoiler alert. Bruce Charlton.
Aslan said, "Your father and mother and all of you are, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead. The term is over, the holidays have begun. The dream is ended, this is the morning." And as he spoke he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. Final words of the Last Battle, the final volume of the Narnia Chronicles by C.S. Lewis.
Theologically, I find a great deal to like about this beautiful ending to the 7 Narnia books. I like that it places the proper goal of our lives in the eternal realm of heaven. And that heaven is a beginning, not an end. I like that his place is heaven and eternal incarnated life necessarily on the other side of death. That this must be so and cannot be otherwise, is surely a fact of creation, else Jesus would not have needed to die to be resurrected. I don't much like the idea that this temporary mortal life is just the Shadowlands. It must be a great deal more than just shadows, a secondary and derivative emanation of the reality, else mortal life would either not be necessary in the first place, just as shadows are not necessary for objects to exist, nor would it be prolonged for so many people, for so many decades. No. I regard this mortal life as real, important, eternal too, or, some aspects of it are potentially real, important and eternal. And after all, Jesus spent 33 years as a mortal man, before moving on to the next and final stage. But classical Christian theology does a poor job of explaining why some people live mortally at all, or for so long, while other persons do not even get out of the womb. This is one of those things for which, if it is important to us, we must each work out an answer ourselves. None of the available off-the-peg theological explanations will do the job, either by not explaining enough, and not accounting for the necessity and variation of incarnated mortal experience, or by explaining too much and implying that particular and prolonged experiences of mortal life are always essential. Spontaneous clairvoyance and symbolic transcendence are unreliable, unconvincing and/or impossible for many, so it is in thinking that we attain contact with the divine and the spiritual. Bruce Charlton. Modern people are no longer, since their young childhoods, able to live spontaneously and naturally, and mostly unconsciously, in the realms of the divine and spiritual, as seems to have been, mostly, the case for our tribal ancestors. Neither does the intermediate symbolism and ritual of religion work as a pathway to the divine and spiritual in the way it did throughout most of history. The effectiveness of such intermediaries is either much weaker, much less consistent between people, or doesn't work at all. Therefore modern man has a problem. I owe to Rudolf Steiner the insight that the proper mode in which modern men, such as you and me, can and should achieve contact with the divine, and the realms of spirit, is thinking. But most of our thinking, most of the time, is utterly mundane in content and carries no necessary meaning. So, it is apparent that only some kinds of thinking can do what is needful, and these I have variously characterized as primary thinking, heart thinking, and direct knowing. All these are intended to refer to the same phenomenon, variously approached and conceptualized. Experience at trying to become aware of such thinking, and observing the experiences of others, leads me to infer that this kind of thinking can only happen when motivations are of the right kind, and that generic or abstract aspirations to be or do good do not suffice to produce the right motivations. So this kind of thinking cannot be done by just wanting and trying. Our motivations must really be such as to align in harmony with divine creation. And when this happens, then primary thinking is what we are doing, if we can but recognize it. I also infer that exercises and techniques do not work when it comes to achieving the right motivations to contact the divine and the spiritual realm. Steiner himself produces great swathes of tedious and tendentious nonsense when he was wrongly motivated, despite his high mastery of meditational methods, and despite that he was genuinely motivated to be loving to everyone and to help other people, albeit in a necessarily generic and abstract way. Steiner seems to have supposed that his benign feelings towards the Anthroposophical Society, or his desire to help those such as teachers, doctors, agriculturalists who approached him for guidance, would be a sufficient motivation. But the results demonstrate that this was in practice insufficient to prevent his outpourings on these, and many, many other, subjects, including a lot of memory regurgitation and sheer invention, and failing to rise to the level of reality, or even objective validity. What can be done? Lacking a valid blueprint of what it is to be good, or even to want good, how can we proceed? As usual, when there is no positive formula, we can only try to avoid that which is negative and preventive, seek and embrace our personal inspiration and aspiration in concrete situations, wherever it may be found, and then recognize and go with primary thinking when we are aware that it is happening. Why the dreadful discernment among those who champion ultimacy? Francis Berger. Ultimacy advocates invest great time and energy casting sinuous word spells to convince you that they and the historical legion of theologians, philosophers, and church fathers they mimic and echo have God and reality all figured out, and that all you need to do in turn is respectfully and humbly bow your head and join the club. At the same time, those who assert ultimacy also tend to be among the worst at discernment in this time and place, which leads to a rather glaring paradox. You would think that all those prolix proclamations about the true nature of God and creation would provide ultimacy upholders with a distinct advantage when it comes to things like discerning good from evil. However, for some mysterious reason, it does not. On the contrary, they consistently rank among the worst at discernment. I find that odd and unsettling. All that philosophy, theology, and tradition rendered instantly meaningless and useless when confronted with something like AI, the Birdemic scam, the 2020 church lockdowns, or mundane politics. Well, not entirely meaningless and useless, because ultimacy aficionados will inevitably utilize all the philosophy, theology, and tradition they can muster to elaborately elucidate why none of the above are actually evil, thereby compounding the problem. Although I have no definitive answer as to why discernment among ultimacy defenders leans toward the disastrous, I strongly suspect the cause lies in their core assumptions, assertions about reality, particularly their assumptions about evil and freedom. Fittingly enough, ultimacy proponents do not seem troubled by their poor discernment. I suspect the nonchalance stems from loving a good mystery, and let's face it, at the end of the day, there is nothing those ultimacy chaps love more than mystery. For them, reality ultimately ends there anyway. Why calls for boycotts and sanctions are a symptom of failing to understand that things are much worse than that. Bruce Charlton. There are people, online especially but also IRL, whose response to the evil nature of the ruling classes is avoidance. It's the puritanical impulse, common to all religions, and found in all denominations, that ranks sins and makes a big thing about publicly and socially avoiding those regarded as worst, on the assumption that this will make people and society overall better. But given that all men are sinners, the Puritan impulse has its dark side. Which is, to summarize, that of allowing or even encouraging the multitude of sins and evils not singled out for enforced surveillance and exclusion. Thus a high-status Puritan, whether religious, or nowadays non- or anti-religious, may be mild-mannered and modest in dress, and strictly avoid alcohol and fornication. And also be extremely spiteful, resentful and cruel. In practice, the avoidance of one or a few special sins allows space and oxygen for the non-special sins to grow unchecked. This is a close analogy to the idea that it is an effective strategy for those who oppose, for instance, leftism to operate by avoidance and exclusion of, supposedly, exemplary wrongness. Such is the call for activism. This stuff may have begun back in the 1950s, when such people often asserted "I don't have a television," which of itself is perfectly fine, but it was said in a way that implied those who do have a television are morally corrupted. When I was a teen, another version of this was people who would boycott some particular organization, because it had ties to some particular nation, that was supposed to be particularly evil. South Africa was the favorite example. And this, at a time, when China's Cultural Revolution was underway. But China wasn't what the right kind of people were talking about, while South Africa was. Nowadays there are people whose response to any currently highlighted instance of the evil strategy of Western institutions is to assert that people just need to stop consuming their output. This amounts to picking one example, or 10, or 100, from among thousands or millions of equivalent evil institutions or persons, focusing on the supposedly special evil of that one. And then assuming that if we stop consuming the product of that one we shall ourselves become better people and create a pressure for general improvement. Such an attitude is evidence of a gross failure to understand that things are much worse than that. We are way beyond any state at which singling out persons or institutions or nations for special disdain can be anything other than a personal idiosyncrasy. As such, as a personal idiosyncrasy, such disengagement and boycotting may well be significant and important. I certainly have particular entities, people, places, institutions etc. that I avoid like the plague, often because they make me viscerally disgusted. It seems like obvious sense that we each should go with such intuitive aversions, but let's not delude ourselves that this makes a difference in any systematic way. But the step from this to, for example, launching some kind of campaign to boycott or block some particular entity, is evidence of dangerously naive ignorance concerning the actual state of our civilization, which is far more systemically and strategically evil than such people realize. The vast volume of socio-political commentary that focuses on criticizing the absurdities and evils of the self-styled left political personalities and parties, is another such failure, because the leftism being critiqued pervades all major personalities and political parties. Similarly, when commentators focus on the supposedly special value corruptions of a particular nation, Canada, New Zealand, UK, France, this is another instance of dangerous incomprehension, because the real problem is qualitative, not quantitative. The problem lies with the entirety of Western civilization, and all its parties, and all its institutions, and all of its leadership class. And their commonly assumed and shared and enforced atheism, materialism, hedonic despair, and pervasive and long-term self-loathing and suicidality. If you don't grasp this, then you are part of the problem, enmeshed in and supportive of the strategic evils of the system, and have no grounds for self-congratulation. And if you do grasp the situation, that things are much worse than implied by assumptions of specific and encapsulated evil, then you will know that picking out particular people or institutions, parties or nations for special and systemic exclusion, and assuming such action will make a difference, is not just futile, but dangerously delusional. 'Tis the season to murder Christmas carols and songs. Bruce Charlton. There must be a generation or two of people who have never heard a Christmas carol or song, sing straight. Sung, that is, at the proper tempo, and in a straightforward arrangement that allows the melody, rhythm and words to be heard as written. Instead, we get a parade of murdering carols and songs. You know what I mean by murdering. Anti-musical activities like slowing them to half speed or even slower, adding decorations intended to show off the singer's technical prowess, and then pitch correcting the voices anyway, cough. Pentatonics. Cough, so that in the end it could be anyone singing. Arrangements that fragment into pieces, and recombine, embedding rap sections, beatboxing, bass and drums. Whatever. Worst of all, exaggeratedly emoting over the lyrics, including when the lyrics are trivial nonsense, and tortured soulfulness is utterly inappropriate. It began back before World War II with some virtues, when the great vocalists of the day such as Sinatra were swinging the classic carols, as Michael Bublé does nowadays, but once the process had begun it just got worse and worse with no bottom in sight. The Little Drummer Boy is essentially a lovely little song. I can recall a version by the Vienna Boys Choir, and another nice version on the Rankin-based stop-motion cartoon of that name. But there are now innumerable anti-musical destructions of it, such as that I encountered last week, as the Muzak while I was drinking coffee. This was a premeditated, first-degree, murderous travesty by a obliteratingly auto-tuned vocalist, I'm being tortured delivery. And, of course, a rapping interlude. Christmas wonder, strangeness, and gratitude. Bruce Charlton. The Christmas season, leading up to the day itself, can be a wonderful experience. It can, and usually does, induce a state of wonder, more than this, a grateful wonder. Christians, me included, sometimes get so keen to explain how reasonable is their faith, how it makes sense, how it answers to both need and reason, that it gets neglected that the whole business is so wonderful that, when understood, it cannot help but evoke a response of "but that's unbelievable." The Christmas story sometimes, and, for me, pretty reliably, has that effect, and maybe that is part of why it is so potent in attaining and sustaining faith. The basic facts of Christianity will always have a quality of too good to be true about them, and the evidence, whether presented as history, or as logical inference, will never be solid or clear enough to convince us solidly of such a strange and marvelous thing. The more we realize how marvelous were the claims of Jesus Christ, the stranger the whole thing seems to be. So the better we grasp the reality of resurrection and heaven, the less convincing seems any possible evidence brought out to support it. The only way that this can work, it seems to me, is when we grasp the whole thing all at once. When, or if, we understand what it is that Jesus did, and its wonder and strangeness, and simultaneously experience a deep conviction of its reality. That's probably what is meant by faith, not so much choosing to believe the extraordinary, as that we need to get it and want it at the same moment, by the same inner act. Put like that, it sounds impossibly complicated, because I have pulled the experience apart in order to explain what is inside it, and then tried to piece it all back together. And this doesn't really work, because, in trying to explain, I had artificially chopped the experience into pieces by a destructive act of division. So the act of explanation is rather like attempting to revive a living being that I had just dissected. Of itself, taken alone, such analysis can't work. In other words, the experience itself is its own proof. And what validates that proof is love. The experience only seems to happen if we not only know, but also love, Jesus, which includes loving what he offers. So I am never surprised that, it seems, not everybody can or does experience this wonderful strangeness and also desire it for themselves, forever. Because, it seems, not everybody has a loving nature. Also, even among those who have a loving nature, and who can and do experience the whole thing, all at once, including the conviction of truth, we are free to reject it, and to prefer something else. That's where something like gratitude comes in. Our Christmas is also about presents, about giving and receiving presents, and presents only do their work when there is gratitude. Jesus has given us the chance of something wonderful and strange, but for it to happen we must be grateful for it, or else why would we want and accept such a gift? So I would add that this sense of gratitude is also an element of the whole and undivided Christmas experience. We get a picture of something wonderful and true, and are simultaneously grateful that such a strange thing really happened, when it might not have happened, and that we personally might not have wanted it. But it did, and we do. What are their plans for 2026, if not sooner? Bruce Charlton. As I have often said, I believe that since late 2020 they are fractured into two main factions of evil. 1. The totalitarians, who are currently mainly interested in implementing AI on the basis that they believe it will serve for detailed mass population surveillance and control. 2. The agents of chaos, who have now taken over and occupy most of the senior leadership positions in the UK relating to population coercion, military, intelligence, law, regulations, police etc. This seems also to apply to the other major nations of Europe, and whose main agenda is currently to start an all-out war with the Fire Nation. It seems the balance of power between totalitarians and AUCS varies between nations and regions. The Eastern, and Southern, national leaderships are solidifying around totalitarianism, and try to expand and maintain systems of bureaucratic international cooperation, aiming at stability, economic growth, mutual enrichment and long-term security of the elites. The West, especially EU and UK, are escalating the rhetoric of war, and explicitly and, with increasing detail, prepping the population for voluntary slaughter to a really extreme degree in recent days and months. These are much less cooperative one with another, having an attitude more like pirates than bureaucrats, and aiming at gratifying short-term lust, grabbing immediate personal power, and spiteful pleasures such as destroying, harming, tormenting, and killing. But it is much easier to pursue an agenda of chaos, than to create and sustain a sustainable system, so, I would predict that there will continue to be a qualitative shift towards destruction, and its consequences, rather than a successful imposition of top-down surveillance and control. What can we, you and me, do, when their plans are all evil, and all intended at our enslavement/destruction? First we must recognize the evils that are being pursued, and, while it is reasonable to recognize lesser and greater evils, we surely need inwardly to reject both sides. and then disengage our best thinking from both of their agendas. Since there is no realistic basis for optimism in the cause of good at a large scale, there can no basis for large-scale material action in a positive cause. No basis for virtuous politics. Okay. If not, then what? Lacking any generic and groupish agenda, we will need to work from the basis of a specific and personal agenda. And here we, each and all, have, indeed must have, specific and personal guidance for what to do. This guidance comes from our own divine and creative souls, and from the Holy Ghost. From these we know what we ought to do, which is why we are sustained alive, here and now. The great thing is that when we are following divine guidance, then everything that we personally need to do, can be done, and by ourselves as we are, in the situation we find ourselves. And they will be effective, which is to say, spiritually effective. They will make a positive difference. This is why spiritual faith is absolutely necessary to being good and doing good here and now, and this must be a faith in the individual personal in alliance with the divine, and a faith that the spiritual is primary and the material is always and necessarily spiritual. There needs to be a faith that real spiritual work is objectively and permanently real. Faith that, as individuals, and without any political influence at all, we make a positive difference to the world always and whenever we think, including do, whatever is harmonious with God's creative plans. Whenever we add our personal creativity to that of God's. And personal doability is one of the ways we know what these things we should do, really are. Star watching, seldom effectively, but worth the wait. Bruce Charlton.
If the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore, and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God which had been shown? But every night come out these envoys of beauty, and light the universe with their admonishing smile. From Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1936.
I look for the moon, planets and stars from my back garden every morning and night, at those times of year when darkness allows. Currently, we only get about 7 hours of daylight, so that bit is easy. I say look for because we live nearish the center of a biggish city, and in England, there is always light pollution and often clouds or mist. So I can only seldom actually get a good view of what I am looking for in the skies. However, somewhat as with Emerson's example above, this does make my rare instances of successful star watching more special. Last weekend, I emerged in the evening and saw a shooting star streak across the eastern skies. Then on doing later research I discovered this was part of the annual Geminid meteor display, so called because it is centered near Castor and Pollux, the heavenly twins in the constellation Gemini, which was due to peak in another day or so. I saw no more that evening. Next morning, I walked out at about 6, and immediately saw a brief horizontal streak, then a long vertical meteor, which lasted a long time, more than a second, and changed colors as it descended in the southwest. I watched it all the way. This seemed very special. Indeed, I may have been the only human to have seen it. A few minutes later I saw another short quick streak, out of the corner of my eye. So much for the Geminids 2025. Because through the whole of the next 2 days, the skies were obscured. That sustained and multicolored, vertical shooting star was my ration. But all the more precious for its rarity. Litmus Test choices, a choice of totalitarian authority and surrender to that, versus heresy, versus romantic Christianity. Bruce Charlton. There is a sense in which anybody that takes one step away from obedience to an authority, will continue to diverge, will continue to become more of what they have started. There is the observed fact that failure on one litmus test issue, or failure on a new litmus test as it arises, almost always leads towards greater corruption. And in this case, the corruption is in practice, assimilation towards the totalitarian program. So, people take a first step, and implicitly accept the authority of those who launched and perpetuated the Birdemic/Peck international coup, or who provoked and escalated the Fire Nation conflict, or who propagandized and imposed the post-November 2022 AI pseudo-revolution. Doing this involves both a decision to 1. Accord authority to the powers who have devised and sustained these strategies, and 2. Also the decision to submit, to a significant extent, to that authority. This applies to individual persons, but also to institutions, including churches. So it is obvious why any single litmus test failure is usually a significant step towards further corruption, because the powers being accorded authority are overall evil in their motivations, and the choice implies obedience to that authority. Authority to evil and obedience to that evil. To summarize, a litmus test failure is therefore both a decision to confer authority upon evil, thereby inwardly submitting to that evil, and a decision to think and act in accordance with that evil. In the short term, this feels good, exactly because totalitarian evil is dominant in our world, especially in the West, and in joining oneself with the system, even to what is, initially, a limited extent, there is a sense of becoming part of something bigger, and of a larger world of increased opportunities for personal status, power, wealth. So, in practice, when someone chooses a litmus test failure, this is not something they do with shame and try to hide, but on the contrary, something boasted about, and, as far as possible, parlayed into increased career, business or social opportunities. The public discourse is currently full of people who have one or more radically dissenting opinions, but whose litmus test fails are actually the basis of their fame, or wealth, or other appeal. And this number is net expanding with every new litmus test, so there have been many new recruits to the totalitarian agenda since AI began to be implemented across all major institutions, top down. Some of these happy successful collaborators are individuals, entrepreneurs of one sort or another, whether would-be cultists or money seekers, or combinations, but many are church Christians of one sort or another. This is how it looks to me. But I can see that there is a superficially similar critique operating from the perspective of traditional Christian religious orthodoxy of the kind that sees Christianity as an entity authoritatively defined and controlled by some particular church, or system, such as a system of authority accorded to the Bible or other scripture, including a particular interpretation of it. Any individual who steps away from the institutionally controlled and validated orthodoxy of Christianity, can be seen, from this church/system perspective, to be on the road to heresy, because, having rejected church authority and been disobedient in one respect, nearly always leads to further rejections and disobediences. Therefore, the traditional orthodoxy of the favored church is defended strongly by asserting that particular church's primary authority, because perceived the alternative is likely to be a collapse of faith, that, it seems, does not have an end point, and leads, it seems, towards Christian apostasy, abandoning the Christian faith altogether. This perception of the anti-Christian consequences of rejecting the chosen authority in any single point, is almost inevitable if and when somebody believes that Christianity just is embodied in an external institutional authority. For an individual instead to assert his personal authority to discern the nature of Christianity, and to accord primacy to what he believes, is a personal, direct and unmediated relationship with Jesus Christ, and God, is therefore regarded by the traditionalist as amounting to the same thing as mainstream atheistic materialism, and its accompanying New Agey spiritual hedonism. For the trad-orthodox church-based religious person, true authority is always external, and true virtue always depends on voluntary obedience to external authority. The crucial distinction for church Christians is between what they regard as the real and valid authority of their church on one side, and the false authority of global totalitarianism on the other. No other possibility is recognized. So any heresy seems analogous to a litmus test failure. Yet from my romantic Christian individual perspective, I observe that the trad-orthodox church-based Christians have in fact failed one after another of the litmus tests, and continue to do so. And for the simple reason that their churches are in fact part of the system of global totalitarianism. As of 2025, a church cannot exist as a socially significant institution, except by being mandatorily locked into the totalitarian system, in a multitude of ways. Financial and economic, legal and employment-wise, and as part of a dense network of regulations to do with buildings, gatherings, social interactions, etc. All of which is enforced by the police, the bureaucracy, and the immense destructive power of the mass/social media. It is a question of whether one is opting out or opting in, and what is being opted into or out from. Into authority or out. Is the opting out from one authority, for example a church, into another authority, secular totalitarianism? Or, is it an opting out from the primacy of external authority? It is a question also of the decision about the location and nature of ultimate authority. Is authority to be outer-institutional to be obeyed, or is it aspirationally rooted in a personal relationship with the divine? And answers to such questions are, in turn, based on what one regards as possible. Mainstream materialists regard the divine as false and impossible. Church Christians regard the divine as necessarily institutionally mediated. But romantic Christians regard the divine as real and rooted in personal relationship. That is the basis of its claim to provide a third option with respect to ultimate authority. Humility and love. William Wildblood. Humility and love are considered two of the primary Christian virtues. They are present in other religions, of course, but not emphasized to the same degree. It is this insistence on humility and love that sometimes gets Christianity accused of being an effeminate religion that promotes a slave morality, a religion that makes men less manly. But what if there was a deeper reason behind this? What if the emphasis on these two virtues was because Christianity was a religion intended for a masculine people with a strong sense of self? Then, far from being a feminine religion, it would be a spiritual corrective, something that counterbalanced innate tendencies and raised the qualities of its destined group of people to a spiritual plane. Christianity is often claimed to be a universal religion, but really for most of its existence it has been a European one. Even the Near Easterners and North Africans of its early days had a strong European component in their makeup, and for the bulk of the last 2,000 years Christianity has been an almost exclusively European religion, lived and developed by people of European origin wherever they might be in the world. Religions are not the same, but most have similar recommendations for behavior. None, though, stress humility and love as Christianity does, and certainly not the Judaic religion from which Christianity emerged. I believe that Christianity was always intended for the European people, and though these people adapted it for their purposes, the core of it was fundamental. Firstly, the focus on Christ the resurrected Son of God, and secondly, the essential teachings of humility and love. These were there partly because they are true, that goes without saying, but also because they could temper the warrior spirit of the Europeans and transform that into a spiritual energy. The blood-stained sword of battle becomes St. Michael's gleaming sword of light. St. Michael may be an archangel, but he is also a chieftain or war leader in the Indo-European style. Warriors become soldiers of God who battle against evil, and we see this in various groups throughout the Middle Ages from the Templars onwards. Believers are not just monks who retire from the world. They are also active in the world to a degree you do not see with Hindus or Buddhists or even Muslims. However, their activity is under the aegis of God, and it is the religious focus on humility and love that transforms the fighting mentality of the pagan Europeans into that of a warrior for truth. The Helion is an epic poem from the 9th century written in Old Saxon. Helion means savior, and the poem is a version of the gospel story that presents Jesus in a form acceptable to the northern European mind, so he is something like a chieftain while his disciples are the band of warriors that surround and support him. For example, the unknown author used the word Troyword to describe faith. This word must be related to our word true, and it means faithfulness rather than faith, or loyalty rather than belief. So the poet is saying that you are saved by faithfulness to Jesus, not simply by believing in him. This would appeal to the pagan mindset of the time much more, and, to my way of thinking, is a better way of describing how spiritual transformation may be brought about. I mention this to show the type of person early Christianity had to deal with and, so to speak, bring to the table. If Jesus had been presented as a soft pacifist who was captured and crucified by his enemies, that would not be appealing, but show him as a king and warrior who voluntarily underwent torture and death to redeem his men, and you make him worthy of being followed and, if necessary, of dying for. Once your leader is revealed as a valiant hero, you are more open to his teachings of humility and love. The trouble now is that humility and love have been weaponized and used to undermine a more complete or properly developed spiritual consciousness. The victim becomes the hero and the hero the oppressor. Humility and love are certainly primary spiritual virtues, but so are wisdom and strength, and the former must be seen in the context of the latter if you are to reach a true spiritual state of being. The soft virtues without the hard ones become spiritually corrosive. Christ came as the revealer of divine love. He, the greatest of all, humbled himself, allowing himself to be killed on the cross, a shameful end. His teaching of humility and love is the key that opens the door to heaven. But that does not mean that we should focus on these to the exclusion of other qualities which are equally important. Besides, all real love derives from love of God, which is love of truth, so you cannot use supposed love to deny truth, as often happens in these times. As for humility, that is only there to remove pride. It is not a matter of encouraging weakness, but points out that true strength is in God. Humility and love were enjoined on the Europeans not because of any defects they might have, but to balance their positive qualities, which were to do with a developed sense of the individual self. This is then lifted up to become a creative contributor to spiritual life. The European type is not interested in passive absorption into oneness, but wants to be an active participant in the glories of creation, but for that to be, his ego must be made clean. Hence humility and love. This footpath, I mean footway, is closed. Bruce Charlton. I recently noticed the weird tendency for the local government to replace the ancient and universally understood term footpath with a new word, footway, on its signage. Decades of experience have taught me that there is always some covert agenda behind such apparently arbitrary changes to language, and I am now more than ever convinced of this. Today I saw a sign stating footway closed, but the word path had been crudely covered with tape, and way had been written over it with a marker pen. This demonstrates to my satisfaction that the change in name comes top down, and has been imposed. And this tells me that the renaming is part of some strategy for reclassifying the legal status of what used to be footpaths. I don't know what this strategy might be, but given the UK local government's zealous obsession with the totalitarian climate rationalised destruction of quality of life, and life itself, the strategy might be something to do with legally allowing/encouraging forms of transportation other than feet, and groups of movers other than pedestrians, to use those tracks that used to be footpaths. Given the local government obsession with providing Rolls-Royce, but nigh unused, facilities for cyclists, justified by climate totalitarianism, and the recent de facto redefinition of cyclists to include electric motorbikes and scooters, I am suspicious that there may be a move towards including once footpaths into the already vast, all but empty, network of cycle tracks. Then pedestrians and women with baby buggies can be mangled and slaughtered en masse by buzzing hordes of 25+mph two-wheelers. Or, simply driven to stay at home cowering behind locked doors. Result: I await developments to see if I am correct. Note, I have done a bit of research about this, however seems to be so much brainwashing, ignorance and dishonesty in what people say, that I found it pretty worthless. The only perhaps useful point was that apparently, footway is regarded as a component of a road as a whole rather than a separate entity. Maybe this provides a helpful definitional loophole for whatever is intended. The two-millennial failure of Christian religion. Bruce Charlton. I admit candidly that my title is more than a little clickbaitish. However, if Christianity is considered as a religion, then it has failed, epically, given that it has had about 2,000 years to succeed. So the sensational title hides a serious point, a very serious point. If Christianity really depends on church membership, then it has failed. Because even after 2 millennia, and being the official religion of several international empires, most people in the world aren't Christian church members. The situation is even worse when it is noticed that most of the main Christian churches have been, more or less, exclusive, and through history did not recognize each other's validity as Christian. From the early centuries of Christianity there have been large sections of what was the church that were excluded, divided, or destroyed: monophysites, Arians, Pelagians, the Great Schism, the Reformation, the Nonconformists, Mormons. Consequently, in practice and throughout history, for any particular church member, the number of real Christians has nearly always been very small, both numerically and as a proportion of mankind. And Christianity in the West now is not just shrinking in terms of church membership and attendance, but is ever more feebly motivating, makes less and less observable positive difference to how people live. Thus we could add that if making a positive difference to how people live is supposed to be the essence of Christianity, then it has failed on that score. If we can imagine ourselves back to the last mortal days of Jesus Christ, what happened after the Ascension could hardly be termed a success. The disciples and early Christians would surely have been very disappointed indeed, at how poorly Christianity has done. Of course the same could be said about other religions, but the difference is that Christians believe that Jesus was divine, that he changed the whole of creation. If that is true, and I believe that it is true, i.e. that Jesus was divine and did positively transform creation, then the limited spread of Christian churches, and their schisms and mutual hatreds and hostilities, must surely be something approaching a refutation. I mean, looking at this world now and through the past 2,000 years, does it really look as if Jesus positively transformed creation? All the above refutations seems to be the case. If Christianity really is supposed to be this worldly and institutional religion. If Christianity is supposed to be something that happens in this world, if becoming a Christian is a thing that must happen in this mortal life, if the definitions and membership of Christianity are in the hands of some self-identified Christian church, or even all Christian churches, then Christianity must regard it as a failure. But if instead we take the fourth gospel seriously as our primary source, and reason from it, then we would instead assume that Jesus changed creation in such a way that its benefits would be independent of any or all churches. But how did Jesus change creation? Even that is a subject of major disagreement. Those who say that Jesus came to make better men, better societies, and save the world, come up against the stark fact that it hasn't worked. But I would say that Jesus made a second creation, heaven, and offered all men the possibility of resurrected eternal life in that heaven. After our death, Jesus himself died before becoming resurrected and ascending to heaven, and so must we. So, in an ultimate sense, it seems clear that when Jesus was doing his work of salvation, he would ensure that the situation in which any man finds himself in this mortal life would not be allowed to prevent each individual from choosing resurrected eternal life. To my mind, this can only mean that the final decision for or against salvation needs to happen after this mortal life. It may happen during mortal life. Any of us may choose to follow Jesus now, but for all men to have the chance and choice, Jesus would need to ensure that that choice does not have to happen in mortal life. And, being a divine creator, this is what Jesus was able to do and did, or so I presume. By offering post-mortal resurrection into a new creation, and by making this a post-mortal choice, Jesus made Christianity into a society-proof faith. All the slow and incomplete growth of churches does not ultimately matter, the apostasies and feeble faith, the schisms and intra-Christian hatreds. These are bad, these have an effect on individual persons, but none of them have prevented the work of Jesus from happening at all times and everywhere over the past 2 millennia. Every one of those who loved and desired to follow Jesus, all who would have wanted salvation, have been and are being given the chance to have this happen, because the choice happens after mortal life. So, even if the religion of Christianity has failed, and seems to be headed for more and greater failure, ultimately this does not stop anyone from following Jesus Christ, even if they are ignorant or misinformed about him during their mortal lives. The divine Jesus made sure that the evil of men would not prevent the good of his own work. Good news, surely. Love, the Amen of creation. Francis Berger. Love works magic. It is the final purpose of world history. The Amen of the universe. Original? Die Liebe wirkt magisch. Sie ist der Inzweck der Weltgeschichte. Das Amen des Universums. The fragment above comes courtesy of Georg Philipp Friedrich von Hardenberg, better and more mercifully known by his pen name, Novalis. I have featured the fragment on the blog before and found myself revisiting it this morning as my thoughts focused on the approach of Christmas. Although I fully appreciate and approve of the message of Novalis's fragment, I will err on the side of presumption by tweaking a few words here and there. To begin with, love certainly does work magic, both in this world and the next. However, it is only in the next world that it becomes eternal, and it only does so after we accept the gift of everlasting life Jesus offers, an acceptance that must be based on a full commitment to love, everlastingly, eternally. In this sense, love is the final purpose of world history. However, confining love within the framework of the world and its history misses the mark somewhat. I humbly revise the 2 lines to read, "It is the final purpose of creation," and then conclude with the Amen of creation. Yes, yes, repeating creation within such a small space of text is certainly unpoetic. Nevertheless, it seems like the only way to underscore the magnificence of Jesus' second creation, heaven, the magic his love worked, and the promise of everlasting love contained within. After all, what is heaven if it is not the Amen of creation? Novalis' profound little fragment stands as a solid encapsulation of what Christianity should be about and, in the final analysis, what Christianity is about. Not first causes, prime movers, absolute this and that's, logos following, and superior society building, but love working magic eternally as the Amen of creation. Note added, Christians have tended to regard the final purpose of the universe as a mystery, claiming that humans can have no solid basis for understanding why God the Creator created. I am of the conviction that it is well past time to leave that mystery behind. Experiencing Winter Solstice in Magical Imagination. Bruce Charlton. I regard the winter solstice as a phase of the year lasting about a week, rather than today specifically. Because day length barely changes for several days, even up here in an extreme latitude, 55 degrees north, on either side of an astronomical solstice. The solstices have the slowest rate of day-to-day change in day length of any time of year, just as the equinoxes have the fastest. Such an insight means that one can, more often, legitimately mark and celebrate the solstice at a time when the skies are clear, and in places where ravening hordes of noisy and crusty neo-pagans are absent. Or, even better, at least for me and people like me, is to create the event in active imagination, from memories and previous imaginings. Such was what the great Christian occultist Gareth Knight recommended, that when we visit enchanted or sacred sites, we are only seldom in an exalted mood, we may be ill, frazzled, distracted, and the situation may not be conducive to a here and now spiritual experience, adverse weather, intrusive crowds. But we should be attentive, observant, give the place a chance to soak into us. And then use these memories, and other memories of a personal, literary, artistic, imagined etc. nature, to recreate and synthesize an ideal experience, at some time later, in meditation. In other words, we can follow the advice of William Wordsworth in that classic statement of Romanticism, the preface to lyrical ballads.
I have said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till, by a species of reaction, the tranquility gradually disappears, and an emotion, kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation, is gradually produced, and does itself actually exist in the mind.
We need, therefore, to put aside notions that meditative recreative imagination is a second-hand or second-rate experience, and realize that this is the definitive mode of enchantment, or participation, for people like us, here and now. Don't envy tribal-minded peoples. It is futile, but also they are being manipulated into spiritual, and material, oblivion. Bruce Charlton. Many of us are, or have been, nostalgic and indeed envious of the remnant tribalisms of this modern world, because we European-descended peoples are not spontaneously tribal by nature, have lost the cohesion of religion, and are nowadays psychologically immune to the top-down ideological phase of nationalism. We each may feel the loneliness and apparent helplessness of social isolation. And anyway, we can't do tribalism, no matter how hard we try. We can't even convince ourselves of it. But if we raise the debate above the pragmatics of short-termist materialistic thriving, it may be observed that we have the inestimable advantage of individual freedom. Because to be, more or less, immersed in the group mind is exclusive of, and on an opposite pole from, the absolute agency of our divine selves. The tribal live and die with the tribe, and are unable to dissociate from the tribal mind. And when that tribe is being manipulated, by the global totalitarian leadership class, into actions that are spiritually destructive, and also tend towards their own long-term material annihilation. Well, the tribal person has little alternative but to go along with the process. The alienated modern European descended Westerner will, and it often happens spontaneously, dissociate himself from any group, therefore he can spiritually stand against, and inwardly oppose, the successful manipulations of the masses. In physical material terms, the alienated man is probably doomed to destruction, just as much as the tribal man, and maybe sooner. But as of 2025 and pervasive rule of global totalitarian evil, spiritually, it is the alienated man who has the advantage over the tribal man, if he chooses to use it. Merry Christmas. William James Tychonievich. Unless the Sync Fairies have other plans, this will likely be my last post until after Epiphany. I wish all my readers a Merry Christmas.
He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth.